Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this Saturday in September. My name is Sierra Fisher. I'm the Associate Director of Esther Productions and the Sterling Brown event. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Brian Gilmore. He's a distinguished poet, writer, public interest attorney, and columnist whose work bridges art, justice, and activism. A fellow of both Cave Canem and Cabillo, as well as a literary fellow with the DC Commission on Arts and Humanities. Mr. Gilmore has been recognized repeatedly for his contributions, including 2 Maryland State Council Authors Awards. He is the author of 2 powerful collections of poetry. Elvis Presley is Alive and Well and Living in Harlem, and Jungle Nights and Soda Fountain Rags, poems for Duke Ellington. His poems and writings have appeared in The Progressive, The Washington Post, and The Baltimore Sun, and many more outlets. Mr. Gilmore also teaches at Michigan State University, where he focuses on housing and economic inequality, issues that deeply inform both his legal work and literary voice. Though he divides his time between Michigan and DC, his impact is felt far beyond any locale. Please welcome Brian Gilmore.
Thank you very much. As was said, I'm Brian Gilmore, Washington, D.C. native, poet, public interest lawyer, and then I teach at the University of Maryland, College Park in the Law and Society program. I'm going to start with a poem by Sterling Brown, and then I'll talk about the relevance of the poem. And as a preface, the N-word is in this poem. And the poem is called No More Worlds to Conquer, and it's from the collected poems of Sterling A. Brown. My boy Alec is a smart bootlegger. He's a race man now, and not anybody's nigger. And the cars he rides in get bigger and bigger. He started with a kettle and he pedaled in a Ford, but now he is reaping his well-earned reward with a packet for himself and a Hudson for his broad. He moves from the slums to the Dickley section, and his shrewd advance in the right direction makes chances slim for Alexander's detection. And now he has customers, senators, and such. He admits his early comrades don't amount to much. So now he rarely speaks to his old boy Dutch. He forgets the coon can and Georgia skin he played for the sake of contract contacts he has made. And his stomps become bows in the colonnade. He sees a poor drunk on Florida Avenue and is pierced by nausea through and through, and he wonders what the race is coming to. Moral: if we only had the brains that are his, we too could be great like my boy is. Magnets in the world's great businesses. Sterling Brown. That section of the book is appropriately called Washington, D.C. But No More Worlds to Conquer is the name of my book that'll be out next year. The full title is No More Worlds to Conquer, the Black Poet in Washington, D.C. It's a cultural history of the building of one of the great poetry scenes in the United States, and perhaps the world, shall we say, but only can speak for the United States, to tell you the truth. And there's a lot of people in this room that were instrumental in making that happen. Of course, Sterling Brown is one of those people as well. Ethelbert Miller is here, Marita Golden is here, Kenneth Carroll is here. All of those people, and of course, Janetta Barris is here. But all of these individuals were part of this scene that was slowly built over time, beginning, as I say in my book, from the time of Paul Laurence Dunbar. Dunbar came here to live in 1898. He lived here for 3 years before he got sick and had to go back to Dayton, Ohio, where he died in 1906. But the impact of a professional poet coming to town in Washington, D.C., and people seeing that example was one of the building blocks that created that scene. So I'm going to read some text from the actual manuscript, which will be out in February of 2026. And I just want to shout out Georgetown University Press, who is publishing the book. Very happy, very great press. Maurice Jackson, of course, he has a book out on Georgetown University Press. They are doing some good work there. But I'll read some segments of it. Sterling Brown is all in the book, I must say. I also made the sojourn to Williams College and saw there's just a great wealth of information there on Sterling Brown and others. You will discover other poets there, and they will lead you to them. And one of those is Warren Cuny. Nobody knew that Warren Cuny and Sterling Brown had kept in touch all those years, but they did. They kept in touch. And there's a nice biography now out about Warren Cuny. So let me read a little bit of this. Some of this stuff you've heard before. Sterling A. Brown's father, Sterling N. Brown, had been born into slavery in Tennessee. Sterling N. Brown, like the son, was an intellectual. Sterling Brown, the son, would have a chance to rise from the challenges faced by his father and by his mother, Adelaide, who was also born into slavery in East Tennessee. The elder Sterling Brown described the area as noteworthy for its healthfulness, general thrift, and fair-minded people. Brown's father was at least 7/8 Caucasian and possibly 1/8 Negro. And like many who had been enslaved, he did not know his family record, nor was it recorded in the public record. Sterling A. Brown, his son, would be born in Washington, D.C. on May 1, 1901, and would grow up on the campus of Howard University. He had 5 older sisters. The Brown family was a struggling middle-class family, and Reverend Brown presided over Lincoln Congregational Church, a church that still stands today. Brown's father passed the concept of esprit de corps to his son. Reverend Brown sank his heart, soul, and effort into the betterment of African Americans in the United States. His son, Sterling, would do the same. Brown's mother would read the poetry of Paul Laurence Dunbar to Brown, while Brown would eventually embrace the imagist poetry of Carl Sandburg and others. Dunbar was part of him deeply as well. Brown praised Dunbar for standing tall in life as a professional black poet and his writing excellence, but also criticized his art for its shortcomings, mainly the dialect poems, which did not quite accept fully the full essence of the African American experience and of ordinary black folks. In a certain way, Sterling Brown, though it was not necessarily intentional, was groomed for his role. He was born in Washington during a time of great change and reckoning for the city's African American population. He attended public schools, which also included matriculation at Paul Laurence Dunbar High, the best high school for African American students in the country at the time. The faculty at Dunbar was world class and included many writers of the day who would distinguish themselves in the world of letters. The black talent could not work outside of the African American spaces in the city, so the talent of black educators was concentrated. It is a reality that the black population accepted, but with a level of quiet determination. Brown, in his famous 1944 essay, Count Us In, stressed that African Americans took a realistic approach to life in America. But Brown would have none of it. He was African American in spirit, culture, and in heart. As he would say in a speech at Williams College in 1973, quote, "I am an old Negro, and I am proud of it. My students get angry because I do not use the word black. I do use the word black. If a person wants to call themselves black, fine. I have had a love of Africa since I was a child, but I do know a lot of people who are talking about going to Africa are going to stop by Paris on the way over. In 1922, while finishing his studies at Williams College, Sterling Brown came to be who he would be for the rest of his life. Just as I was pretty sure in 1985 that I was going to be a poet and work in public service, Brown had done the same by 1922. One of his professors, George Dutton, was giving a lecture on Joseph Conrad, the Polish writer and author of, among other works, Heart of Darkness. It was suggested by Professor Dutton that Conrad wanted to help his people in Poland in some manner, and that Conrad likely brooded over the challenge presented to him. Brown said that Dutton looked at him when he related the challenge set before Conrad. Brown took the moment as a challenge to himself and the plight of African Americans in the United States. Brown said he knew what Professor Dutton meant. To Brown, he was saying, quote, "Don't get fooled by any lionizing, and surely don't get fooled by being allowed to exist and sit among selective clientele." Brown knew there was business out there that he had to take care of, and that business was his people, African Americans. Brown described the Dutton lecture as a turning point in his professional life, and after bouncing around the South for several years, Brown's true turning point arrived when he came to teach at Howard University in 1929. Brown would remain there for 4 decades, teaching, publishing, advocating, and creating a body of work unparalleled in American literature. He also mentored many of the poets who would shape American literature and African American literature, and who would build an important black literary scene in Washington, D.C. What Brown lacked in quantity, he exceeded most in quality and importance of work. And where most feared to tread, Brown did over and over. His people, as he noted, became his work and his mission. And he honored the opportunity at Howard in the academic world with aesthetic choices that continue to illuminate and teach today. The Washington, D.C. black poets are nothing without Sterling Brown. Gaston Neal, E. Ethelbert Miller, Kenneth Carroll, Jennifer Smith, Darrell Stover, and Laini Mataka are the poets. They are, at least in part, because of Sterling Brown's work and example. Sterling Brown's arrival at Howard and onto the national poetry scene occurred at a time of great distress. The country was on the cusp of the Great Depression. While Washington, D.C. was somewhat sheltered from the effects, white supremacy and its entrenched policies caused African Americans to feel the effects of the economic downturn disproportionately. Jobs traditionally held by African Americans in cities such as janitors, bellhops, waiters, elevator operators, and barbers were taken over by whites as whites asserted superior claims to work. James Weldon Johnson wrote the original introduction to Sterling Brown's Southern Road. Johnson had included Brown in the revised edition of his poetry anthology, The Book of American Negro Poetry. He spoke highly of Brown in the preface and in his autobiographical introduction. Quote, Johnson wrote that Brown, more than any other poet, has made thematic use of Negro folk epics and ballads. Johnson added that a false note is rarely heard of Brown's work, and he really absorbed the spirit of folk poetry, made it his own, and without diluting its primitive frankness and raciness, truly re-expressed it with artistry and magnified power. Johnson has similar praise in his introduction to Southern Road. He groups Brown in with many of the emerging Harlem Renaissance poets deemed the younger group: Claude McKay, Jean Toomer, Langston Hughes, County Cullen, and finally Brown, who was the last to emerge. Johnson specifically described Brown's poetry as fine and unique, and having discarded the minstrel dialect that was typical of the Dunbar period and after. In 1932, Brown was published in the anthology series Folks Say. Brown appeared in volume 4, edited by B.A. Botkin. The volume was called The Land Is Ours. Botkin was a folklorist and scholar who taught at various universities and spent much of his career in this field, including time in the Federal Writers Project. The poems Botkin published are in Southern Road. Sterling Brown dedicated the books in Southern Road to my mother. It was his mother, who he would acknowledge many years later, who read poetry to him as a boy, including the poetry of Paul Laurence Dunbar. So I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit and then finish up here. Originally, Southern Road is published by Harcourt, Brace and Company in 1932. It immediately garners attention in the literary world. My many critics, such as Henry Louis Gates, try to write Brown out of the Black Renaissance period that began in the 1920s. Brown rejects that idea. Brown believes that the Renaissance that began many years ago lasted much longer than a few years. Brown contends that the period stretched well into the 30s. This means that Brown considers Southern Road part of everything that had been going on before and after his entry in the scene. Most of the responses to the book were very good and reflect the fact that Brown had broken through artistically. Louis Untermeyer writes of Southern Road, "This review must begin with a confession. I have seen separate poems under the name Sterling Brown. I had heard his praises here and there, but to skepticism of one who reads too much, I imagined Brown was merely another Negro poet, gifted as so many of the young writers are, another of James Weldon Johnson's interesting but not important enthusiasms." Untermeyer, a well-respected, self-taught poet, was prolific throughout his life. He not only wrote many books of his own, but he produced many anthologies of note. Untermeyer mentioned that Brown, in his poetry, does not adopt the attitude of the Negro as entertainer, though Brown's humor is significant. Brown does not paint himself blacker than he is, nor does he slouch in grotesque or falsely sentimental verse to win the applause of the white audience. Southern Road is also reviewed by the writer Wallace Thurman, the author of the timeless classic, The Blacker the Berry, the Sweeter the Juice. No, The Blacker the Berry, a novel of Negro life, actually. Thurman, like Untermeyer, admits that he was skeptical of Brown when he came to Southern Road. Thurman changes his mind. Thurman's exposure to Brown's early work was in the 1920s. Thurman is so impressed with Brown and Southern Road that he writes that Brown must have been holding out, or it is he who has overlooked Brown. Thurman describes the poems as excellent. Thurman describes Brown's poetry as not conventional or stereotyped, and poetry that is intelligent and sensitive with a sense of adventure. Poetry Magazine's review of Brown's Southern Road is racist and dismissive. The review does not identify the author, and it is very short. A Negro student who has progressed in his poetic technique to the point indicated by the youthful stanzas in part 4 of this volume can no longer consider himself a primitive, and must achieve in attempting to go back to his racial beginnings more than a mongrel effect. And he actually wrote that. He has followed Housman, Shakespeare, and other masters of English lyricism too far. His salvation lies in following them farther. The journal makes no effort to analyze Brown's work honestly. Brown's book rejects most of what Western literature is, and so Brown is likewise rejected by the establishment journal. The New York Times describes Southern Road as a notable book of Negro poetry, a book where race is on every page, but it is race that is neither arrogant nor servile. The poetry contains bitterness, but it is not the bitterness of black people in America, but the bitterness of all men. The Times singles out Maumee Ruth and Sam Smiley as 2 examples of poems by Brown that fit the mold. While some of the review is overtly condescending, it is still a very good review. The review was so good that the Pittsburgh Courier made note of the review in the Time. As a result of Southern Road, Brown's literary life would be quite different. He would never become a commercial literary force in America like his colleague Langston Hughes or Paul Laurence Dunbar before that. However, his reputation would be forever that of a giant of authentic American poetry, Black culture, and the intellectual successor to W.E.B. Du Bois. But that's just some of the writings from the book. There's several sections that deal with Sterling Brown in the book and his impact. Of course, later on, as some people in your room, Ethelbert probably can tell you more about it, he became sort of was discovered again, and he had already left Howard. By then, he's discovered with Southern Road, and then they kind of, as somebody said earlier, he's kind of buried. They kind of bury him, and he refuses to compromise on his poetry, so he doesn't get any more collections. Not until Michael Harper's and the Yale Prize and the National Writers Prize. I mean, that's when he kind of comes back, and then in the late '70s, he is discovered again by his city and by the university, who kind of didn't want anything to do with him, but. I mean, I'm just stating what the research tells you about. But I just want to, as I finish up here on my remarks, just want to thank some other people in the room who are very instrumental. I called out names of poets, but of course, Mark Saunders, who spoke here, I met him many years ago in 1995, and I think his Sterling Brown book was already out by then. But that book was essential to my research and then leading me to other things. And of course, Joanne's book was essential as well. And I remember reading Joanne's book, and I'm saying, oh, man, I'm glad she wrote about all this stuff, because I don't have to write about that part of it. So they can just go to Joanne's book. I'll focus on what I want to focus on. And I'm probably leaving a few, other person is Marcia Davis. This whole book project, Marcia gave me an assignment when she was the editor at the Post to write something about Langston Hughes, the 100th anniversary of Langston Hughes' birth, and how he came to D.C. and he lived here. I think that one of the patterns here you see in D.C., unlike other cities, is people come here, the Black poets come here, and they stay here for like 2 or 3 years, and then they and then they go off. They come here and they come to the workshops and they hanging out with you and everything, and then they go somewhere else, and then they like blow up, you know what I mean? They get like really famous. They say, oh look, that guy used to be in D.C. I mean, it's pretty funny. It's like that. Dunbar was here for a couple years, and then Langston Hughes was here for 2 or 3 years, and it's a pattern to that, you know what I mean? You could even say Gaston Neal's from Pittsburgh, and he came here and he jumped right into the poetry thing. So it's a lot of that, and a lot of that is in the book, because I think those connections are what makes our scene here amongst the Black poets, at least, so unique, and it continues to build from, at least most recently, what I know, you had the Ascension series with Ethelbert, and then after that you had other venues. You had 8 Rock in Southeast DC. Kenny Carroll was running that. You had It's Your Mug. That was Tony Asante Lightfoot. And then you had the workshops. DC there's always like a workshop going on somewhere. There's probably like 5 of them going on right now somewhere. I mean, people here like to get together and like really, really, you got to get this right. You know what I mean? You got to get this right on the page. It's probably because it's a paper pusher town. You know what I mean? It's a government town. So those are my remarks. I hope all of y'all will buy the book. In February of 2026, and I will also say that it's already on the Georgetown University Press site for pre-order if you want to like.
When's it coming out again?
February 2026. It's already on the Georgetown University Press website. for pre-order. And will say that I will say in closing that if I always say this, I say this to Kenny all the time, if I get disappeared by ICE, y'all make sure the book gets out.
Can we have another round of applause for Brian?